In a crowded auditorium, an invisible woman was turned into a target of laughter by an arrogant millionaire who believed he was above everyone. What no one knew is that behind the simple uniform and the resigned silence, there existed a mind capable of rewriting destiny in a few minutes. When an impossible challenge was launched in public, something unexpected happened, and the power shifted sides before hundreds of witnesses. What began as humiliation became a turnaround so impactful that no one in that place left the same. Before discovering how this surprising story unfolds, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell for more reports that prove that true talent can never be erased. The white marble of the main lobby of the Universidade Federal de Brasilia reflected the cold light of the neon tubes with an almost surgical coldness. It was 4:20 in the morning when Fernanda pushed the cleaning cart through the central corridor, the wheels creaking in a low and constant rhythm that she no longer even heard. 6 months of pregnancy made each step heavier than the last, and she had learned to distribute her body weight in an almost mechanical way, her spine always slightly tilted to compensate for what was growing inside her. The corridor was empty. It was always empty at that time, and that was exactly what she needed. She stopped before the door of Block C and looked for the ring of keys in her navy blue apron. The faded label on the right key said, "Aud Professor Alcantara," and she fitted it into the lock with the familiarity of someone who has repeated the gesture for more than a year. The auditorium opened before her like a dark mouth. She turned on only the lights of the side corridor, enough to work without drawing the attention of anyone passing outside. The event would begin in less than 5 hours. She knew this because she had seen the posters scattered across the campus for weeks. The Congresso Nacional de Innovação Farmacêutica, with the confirmed presence of the businessman Henrique Saldanha, founder of Grupo Saldanha Laboratories, considered the most influential man in the private health sector in Brazil. Her name had already been on some of those posters years ago, in smaller letters, of course, but it was there. Fernanda wiped the cloth over the first row of chairs and let the thought go before it hurt too much. She was 32 years old and had a story she preferred not to tell. Graduated with honors in pharmacy from the very university where she now swept the floor, she had completed a master's degree in pharmacokinetics, with research that had attracted the attention of professors and 1 or 2 researchers from abroad. She had the beginning of a doctorate, an advisor who believed in her, and the sensation, rare and fragile, of being in the right place. Then came the complications, an unplanned pregnancy with a man who disappeared before she finished the first sentence of the conversation, a medical leave that extended, the research scholarship cut due to a bureaucratic irregularity that she did not have the strength to contest at the right time. The advisor transferred to another institution, and when she returned, the laboratory that had been hers already had another name on the door. There was no one to blame in a clear way. It was the type of collapse that happens slowly, invisible, built from overlapping oversights until it becomes a ruin. She applied for the job of General Services Assistant 6 months later. The Human Resources Coordinator looked at her with that expression that Fernanda had come to recognize, a mixture of contained pity and relief that it wasn't her. The hiring was quick. The university always needed cleaners. The auditorium had capacity for 300 people, and an old blackboard in the center of the stage that no one used anymore, but which the administration refused to remove for reasons Fernanda never understood. When she reached the front of the stage to clean the baseboard, she noticed that someone had written on the board. It wasn't uncommon. Professors sometimes left notes for the next class or forgot equations from the previous day. But that was not a careless note. It was a problem, a long, detailed problem, written in white chalk in small and precise letters, occupying almost 2/3 of the board. Fernanda leaned the handle of the squeegee against the cart and approached without realizing she was doing so. The central equation involved multi-compartment pharmacokinetic modeling, exactly the field in which she had worked for almost 4 years. There were distribution parameters, elimination constants, an integral that described the plasma concentration curve of a compound in 2 simultaneous tissues with differentiated absorption. It was the type of problem that appeared in high-level congresses, not on university boards at 4 in the morning. Fernanda tilted her head. There was an error in the second line of the derivation. Subtle, but it was there. She stood still for a moment, looking at the error with the same expression she had when, years ago, she found inconsistencies in laboratory data. Concentrated, quiet, and with that slight tightening of the lips that her advisor used to call the face that solves problems. Then she took a deep breath, adjusted the apron over her belly, and returned to the cart. She had a floor to clean. In the following hours, the auditorium began taking shape. She organized the chairs, cleaned the side tables, replaced the water glasses on the speaker's table, swept the access corridor, and polished the stage floor with the equipment that hissed more than it should. At 6:30, when the sky outside began to lighten with that purple typical of the Cerrado before dawn, she stopped to drink water, leaning against the back wall. The board was still there. The error, too. Fernanda closed her eyes for an instant. She felt the baby move, a slow and rotating movement that she had learned to recognize as her son settling his shoulder. She placed her hand on her abdomen without thinking, an automatic gesture that had become as natural as breathing. When she opened her eyes, the board was still in front of her. She finished her shift at 7:40. She pushed the cart back to the supply room, washed her hands in the service bathroom, changed her shoes, and left through the access corridor to the parking lot. Outside, the campus was beginning to wake up. Students with heavy backpacks walked in scattered groups. A professor crossed the courtyard on a bicycle. A group of security employees talked near the guardhouse. No one looked at her. This no longer surprised her. There was a way of walking that people develop when they don't want to be seen, and she had perfected it unintentionally. Head slightly lowered, steady steps, no prolonged eye contact. It was almost a skill, she thought, the art of occupying space without claiming attention. She lived in a boarding house 20 minutes' walk from the university, shared with 3 other women. The room was small, but had a window that looked out onto an old mango tree, and Fernanda had learned to like that tree in a silent way, as one likes things that promise nothing but are always there. She slept until noon, woke up hungry, ate what was in the fridge, cold rice and half an avocado, and sat for a while on the edge of the bed looking at the wall. At 14 hours, she received a message from the service coordinator. There was an unforeseen event. The employee who would cover the second shift of the auditorium had cancelled. Fernanda would need to return at 16 hours to perform maintenance before the start of the event. She looked at the message for a few seconds, then she typed, "It's fine, I'll go." The Congress would begin at 18 hours. She would be there. The auditorium at 16 hours had a completely different energy than at dawn. Sound technicians tested microphones with those 3 rhythmic taps that echoed through the empty space. A man in a white shirt adjusted the lighting panel at the back of the room, throwing colored beams against the stage as if he were rehearsing a play. 2 university communication assistants circulated with clipboards, checking the arrangement of banners and the registration desk that had been set up at the entrance. Fernanda entered through the side corridor with the cleaning cart and passed through all of that without anyone raising their eyes. Sua's task was simple: a last pass on the stage floor, refilling water in the speakers' bottles, and checking if the corridor bathrooms were in order before the public began to arrive. She calculated she would need a little more than an hour. It would be enough to finish before 17:30, when the reception would begin. But when she went up to the stage to polish the floor, the blackboard caught her attention again. The equation was still there, intact. No one had erased it. Fernanda stopped with the cloth in her hand and reread the second line of the derivation. The error was exactly where she had identified it at dawn. An elimination constant applied without considering the differentiated distribution between the 2 compartments, which made the final solution mathematically coherent but biologically impossible. Any experienced researcher in pharmacokinetics would identify the problem, but only if they knew where to look. She turned her back to the board and continued the work. The first guests began to arrive at 17:15. Fernanda was still in the corridor bathrooms when she heard the movement grow outside. Voices, leather shoes on marble, the dry noise of badges being put on. She quickened her pace, put away the cleaning materials in the service closet, and was about to leave through the access corridor when the coordinator appeared in front of her. Donna Conceição was in her 50s, with grey hair tied with an elastic and a silent efficiency that Fernanda respected. She was the only person in that environment who treated her by her name with a consistency that didn't seem like an effort. "Fernanda, can you stay one more hour? Marcia won't be able to cover the Congress break, and they will need someone to replenish the coffee break in the external corridor." Fernanda looked at the already lively corridor, at the groups of researchers talking around the tables with white cloths, at the waiters in vests positioning trays. She felt the weight in her back and the sun move once, slowly. "I can stay," she said. The Congress opened with a speech by the university rector, a tall man with glasses who spoke for 15 minutes about public-private partnerships and responsible innovation, with the intonation of someone who has been repeating the same speech in slightly different contexts for years. Fernanda was in the external corridor organizing cups when the sound of the microphone changed timbre and the audience reacted with a different murmur, sharper, more anxious. "It is an immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Enrique Saldanha, founder and president of Grupo Saldanha, a strategic partner of this university and one of the biggest names in the national pharmaceutical industry." The applause reached the corridor like a muffled wave. Fernanda knew the name. Everyone in the sector knew it. Enrique Saldanha was in his 60s, had built a group of laboratories that dominated 3 segments of the Brazilian pharmaceutical market, and had the reputation of being as brilliant as he was pitiless. He had published articles in international journals in the 90s, before migrating completely to the business side. In recent years, he had also become a public figure, frequent in interviews and panels, always with that combination of authority and disdain that certain successful men develop as a second nature. She saw him for the first time when he entered the external corridor during the first break. Enrique Saldanha was taller than she imagined. Dark grey suit, discreetly expensive watch, well-cut white hair. He was accompanied by 2 assistants and a corporate-looking woman who seemed to filter the space in front of him. The group stopped near the coffee table, and one of the assistants reached out to grab a cup and dropped a spoon that fell with a clink on the marble floor. Fernanda was 2 steps away. She bent down to pick up the spoon before anyone needed to ask. That was when Enrique Saldanha saw her. His gaze ran over the navy blue apron, the evident belly under the fabric, the cleaning cart in the background. There was in that gaze a quick and complete evaluation that left no residue of consideration. "Watch out for the wet floor," he said without looking at her directly. "I don't want anyone slipping here." One of the assistants gave a short laugh, the kind that isn't funny at all, but confirms hierarchy. Fernanda placed the spoon on the disposal tray and returned to her position. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. But something in that moment stuck, not as a grudge. She had developed a kind of impermeability to that kind of thing over the last year, a thin and resistant layer that protected without hardening too much. It was more like a record, a mental note filed without urgency. The second block of the Congress began at 1840. Fernanda was finishing the coffee replenishment when the coordinator appeared again. "They are going to need someone inside the auditorium during the session, just to maintain the order of the glasses and see if any equipment needs adjustment. Can you do it?" Fernanda looked at the clock on the wall. Her feet hurt. Her lower back asked for rest. The baby was quiet, which was a good sign. "I can," she said. She entered the auditorium through the side corridor and stood by the back wall, discreetly positioned between the emergency exit and the last block of chairs. The audience was almost full. 300 people, maybe a bit more, in attentive silence, while a researcher presented data on the bioavailability of lipophilic compounds in animal models. Fernanda followed the presentation unintentionally. The slides were well constructed, the methodology solid, but there was an imprecision in the statistical interpretation that she identified on the third slide and couldn't stop seeing in the following ones. When the presentation ended, Enrique Saldanha went up to the stage for the closing panel. He spoke about the future of pharmaceutical innovation in Brazil with the fluency of someone who masters the subject and knows they master it. The audience listened to him with that particular attention reserved for those who have enough power and money for their opinions to seem like facts. It was then that he turned to the blackboard still covered by the equation and smiled for the first time since Fernanda had seen him. "Someone here told me that this problem has been on the board since yesterday," he said, with that tone that mixes challenge and entertainment. "I put it there myself. It is a real problem from my research department. My team still hasn't solved it." He paused. "I offer 3 million reais to whoever can solve it now, here, in front of everyone." The audience reacted with laughter and scattered comments. Someone applauded. Henrique Saldanha swept the auditorium with his gaze, and when his eyes reached the back wall, they found Fernanda. He smiled again. This time, the intention was completely different. "Or perhaps," he said into the microphone, with a lightness that was no lightness at all, "our cleaning lady wants to try. 3 million is a lot of money for those who need it." The laughter that ran through the auditorium was too long to be discomfort. It was amusement. Fernanda stood still by the wall. She felt the 300 pairs of eyes turn to her at the same time, like a heavy and hot spotlight. She felt her belly, the fatigue, the feet that throbbed. She felt the equation on the board, which she had read 3 times that day, and whose error she knew as if it were her own. And then something moved inside her. Not her son, this time. It was something else, older. She moved away from the wall, moved. The silence that settled in the auditorium had a specific quality. It was not the silence of expectation, but that of suspended incredulity, that instant in which the collective has not yet decided how to react to what it is seeing. 300 pairs of eyes followed Fernanda as she left the shadow of the back wall and walked down the side aisle towards the stage, the navy blue apron, the cart left behind, the 6-month belly projected forward with a dignity she had not planned. Someone in the audience whispered something. There was a muffled laugh. Then another. Henrique Saldanha, still at the microphone, watched with that expression of someone who started a game and is now curious to see how far it goes, not because he believes he will lose, but because the spectacle has its own value. He made a wide gesture with his arm toward the board, like an auditorium show host inviting an unlikely participant to the stage. "Please," he said with a lightness that was a disguised knife, "the board is all yours." Fernanda climbed the 2 steps of the stage without haste. Her feet had been hurting since 3 in the afternoon, and she had learned to separate the pain from the movement, to let the body function independently of what it felt. She reached the board and stood still for a moment, her back to the audience, looking at the equation. It was like revisiting a language you have spoken since childhood, but haven't used in years. There was no strangeness. There was recognition, immediate, clean, almost affectionate. She picked up the chalk that was on the lower tray of the board. It was a short piece, with one of the ends worn, and she held it between her thumb and index finger with the mechanical care of someone who has written with chalk hundreds of times in situations where making a mistake had real consequences. "The problem," she said, with a voice she hadn't planned to use out loud that day or that year, "is in the second line." The voice came out firmer than she expected, not loud but clear, with that quality that professors develop when they need to be heard by people who are looking at other things. The audience went quiet in a different way. Fernanda pointed to the derivation with the piece of chalk. The elimination constant here was applied as if the 2 compartments had the same distribution rate. But this compound, by the structure of the equation, it is lipophilic with high affinity for adipose tissue, behaves asymmetrically, which means that the integral needs to be separated by compartment before any elimination operation. She began to write beside the original equation. Her handwriting on the board was small and precise, without ornaments, the type of writing that belongs to laboratories and not to conventional classrooms. "If I take the constant K1 for the central compartment and K2 for the peripheral one, with the respective distribution volumes VD1 and VD2, the correct derivation follows this path." As she wrote, something happened in the audience that she was not seeing, but that some present described later as a change in temperature in the room. The laughter had stopped. The whispers had stopped. People who had cell phones in their hands lowered them. A professor in the 5th row, a specialist in pharmacodynamics with 22 years of teaching, leaned slightly forward. Fernanda continued. Not because she was performing for the audience. She had forgotten the audience. It was an old habit, that one, of disappearing inside the problem. Her advisor used to say she had the rare gift of working as if there were no one watching, which made the result cleaner and more honest than that of people who work to impress. The resulting integral, she said, completing the penultimate line, gives a plasma concentration curve that takes into account the redistribution time between the compartments, which significantly changes the therapeutic window of the compound. She wrote the final solution. 2/3 of the board were now covered with her small handwriting. Then she took a step to the side, faced the audience, and placed the chalk on the tray. The silence lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. The professor in the 5th row stood up, not to applaud, to see better. He adjusted his glasses and ran his eyes over the solution from left to right, then returned to the point of separation of the compartments, then to the integral. Then he looked at Fernanda with an expression she recognized from another time, the expression of someone who has just found something they didn't expect. "It is correct," he said, not into the microphone, to the people around him, but the room was so quiet that his voice reached everyone. "Not just correct, it is the most elegant approach I have ever seen for this type of bicompartmental modeling." The auditorium exploded, not in an orderly way. It was a confused wave of applause, exclamations, people standing up, others turning to the sides to comment to whoever was next to them. Someone in the back shouted something Fernanda couldn't understand. Several cell phones were raised at the same time. Henrique Saldanha had remained motionless beside the microphone since she had started writing. Now his face was in a composition she couldn't immediately classify. There was tension in the jaws. There was something in the eyes that was not simply surprise. It was the specific expression of someone who threw a challenge as a joke and discovered the joke has real consequences. One of his assistants leaned in and whispered something in his ear. He made a minimal gesture with his hand that could mean anything. Fernanda was standing in the center of the stage, with the applause breaking around her like water, and she felt something she hadn't felt in so long that she almost didn't recognize it, the sensation of occupying a space as if she had a right to it. The professor who had stood up went onto the stage. His name was Renato Cavalcante, she would learn later, a tenured professor in the Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences of the university itself. He extended his hand. "My name is Renato Cavalcante. With whom do I have the pleasure?" "Fernanda," she said. "Fernanda Leal." He shook her hand firmly and turned to the still agitated audience. "What we have just seen," he said with the voice of someone used to making silence when they speak, "is an advanced graduate-level solution to a problem that my department has been discussing for weeks without consensus." He looked at Fernanda. "Where do you work?" Fernanda looked at her apron, then at him. "Here," she said. And the way she said it, without irony, without bitterness, just with the precision of someone who doesn't have the energy to bypass the truth, made the professor stay quiet for a moment, processing what that word contained. At the back of the stage, Henrique Saldanha was still standing. His assistant whispered again. This time he responded in a low voice, and the expression on his face had changed, not to remorse, not yet, but to something more calculated. The type of reassessment that men like him make when they realize the ground under their feet is different than it seemed. The promise of the 3 million was in the air, pronounced into the microphone before 300 people and at least 15 cell phones filming. Fernanda went down from the stage with the applause still present. She went back to the cleaning cart. She placed her hands on the cold metal handles, and then she stopped because her legs were not well. Fernanda's legs gave way without warning, not a dramatic collapse, but a sudden tremor in her knees that made her support all her weight on the handles of the cleaning cart with disproportionate force. The metal creaked slightly. She stayed like that for a few seconds, breathing carefully, waiting for the dizziness to pass. Dona Conceição appeared out of nowhere, as she always did whenever there was an undeclared need. "Come with me," she said in a low voice without asking questions. Fernanda was taken to the service coordination room, a small room with 2 chairs, a table with papers, and an old refrigerator that hummed. Dona Conceição brought water and a sodium cracker from a package she kept in the drawer. Fernanda ate slowly, leaning against the back of the chair with her hand flat over her abdomen. "Are you okay?" Donna Conceição asked. "I am," Fernanda said. "It was the heat, and I've been on my feet since early." The coordinator looked at her with that kind of attention that mothers develop and that some women without children also have, a silent reading that goes beyond what is said. She asked no more questions. She pulled the second chair and sat beside her. From the corridor came the sounds of the Congress restarting after the agitation. Overlapping voices, the microphone being tested again, quick steps of people who had urgent things to resolve. Fernanda imagined what was happening inside. The scene on the stage had created a specific type of social turbulence, the kind that happens when the expected script is violated in a public and irrevocable way. She didn't think about the 3 million. Not at that moment. She thought about her son, who had been too quiet during those minutes on the stage, as if he had also been paying attention. 20 minutes later, the door to the coordination room opened. It was Professor Renato Cavalcante. He knocked lightly on the doorframe before entering, which Fernanda registered as an involuntarily revealing gesture, the kindness of asking permission to enter a space that technically was not hers. "I was informed you were here," he said. "Sorry for the intrusion." Donna Conceição stood up. "I can let you two talk for a bit." Renato Cavalcante pulled the chair that had been vacated and sat with the posture of someone used to difficult meetings who has learned that sitting conveys more respect than standing. He was about 50 years old, with grey hair at the temples, an expression that combined genuine curiosity with something that looked like anticipated guilt. "Fernanda Leal," he said, as if verifying the name out loud. "I have worked at this university for 22 years. How long have you worked here?" 1 year and 3 months, she said. He nodded slowly. "Before that?" Fernanda looked at him for a moment. There was a choice to be made there, not of revealing or hiding, because the apron already said enough about where she had arrived, but of deciding how much of the trajectory was worth telling a stranger in a small room while her abdomen hurt slightly. Undergraduate degree here with honors, Masters in Pharmacokinetics completed, start of a doctorate interrupted. She stopped. Complications. Renato was quiet for a moment. "Do you have publications?" 3 articles, 2 as first author, 1 in an international index journal. He took a cell phone from his pocket and typed something. Fernanda imagined he was searching for her name. There was a time when that thought would have caused her pride. Now it caused only a kind of anticipated fatigue, the sensation of being rediscovered by someone who could have noticed before, if they had looked to the sides. "The problem on the board," Renato said, putting away the cell phone. "When did you see it?" "At 4 in the morning. I was here cleaning the auditorium." Something passed through his face. It wasn't pity. It was more complex than that. It was the specific recognition of someone who belongs to a system and has just seen up close what that system does to those it ignores. "Fernanda, what happened this afternoon is going to spread. It is already spreading. There were at least 20 people filming when you solved that equation." She knew. She had seen the raised cell phones. "Professor Saldanha will need to fulfill what he promised," Renato continued. 3 million reais declared into the microphone before 300 witnesses and cameras. He knows that. His assistants were already calculating while you were still on stage. Fernanda said nothing. "But I didn't come to talk about the money," he said. "I came to ask what you want." The question hung in the air with a weight she didn't expect. It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was genuine, and its genuineness was, paradoxically, difficult to receive, because it had been so long since anyone had asked it that she had stopped having a ready answer. What she wanted. She wanted to finish her doctorate. She wanted a laboratory with the right reagents and enough time to think. She wanted her son to be born in a place where she could pay the rent without calculating the day of the month. She wanted the equation she had solved that afternoon not to be an isolated performance, but the beginning of something that had continuity. "I want to go back," she said. Renato nodded. "We can work on that." The conversation was interrupted when one of Henrique Saldanha's assistants opened the door without knocking. He was younger than he seemed from afar, maybe 30 years old, with the sharp posture of someone who has learned to move in the boss's environments. He looked at Fernanda, then at Renato, and decided to speak to the professor as if she were not present. "Dr. Saldanha would like to speak with the lady," he said, correcting himself only on the pronoun. Fernanda looked at the assistant for a moment, then at Renato. "Tell him I am here," she replied. The assistant blinked. Clearly it was not the expected answer. He left. 2 minutes later, Henrique Saldanha entered the room. The space became smaller immediately, not because he was physically imposing, but because there was in him that quality of presence that years of power build in some people, an occupation of space that goes beyond the size of the body. He looked at Fernanda. She looked back at him. The silence between them had a dense texture. "You surprised me," he said. The voice had lost the auditorium tone. It was lower now, more controlled. "It was not my intention," she said. Henrique Saldanha looked at Professor Renato for an instant, then back to her. "The problem you solved is real. It is part of a compound development project that my team has been working on for 2 years. The solution you presented—" He stopped, as if weighing each word with more care than was his custom. "Solves an obstacle that cost us 6 months. Fernanda remained silent. "And I will honor my promise," he said. "The 3 million will be transferred yet this week." "I know you will," she replied. "There were cameras." Something in Henrique Saldanha's face changed slightly with that sentence. It was an answer he didn't expect, not for hostility, which there wasn't, but for the clinical coldness with which she described the only reason he was there fulfilling the promise. It was an uncomfortable precision. He kept looking at her for a few more seconds. Then he said, in a way that sounded less rehearsed than the rest, "Who are you, Fernanda Leal?" She looked at the navy blue apron one last time, then at him. "I am the person who solved your problem," she said, "and who will solve others if given the chance." Renato Cavalcante beside her said nothing, but she saw him smile at the notebook he was holding. The video was 2 minutes and 43 seconds long. Someone had edited the raw material with surprising competence. It began with the wide shot of the full auditorium, cut to the close-up of Henrique Saldanha's face, making the comment about the cleaning lady, then opened to Fernanda moving away from the back wall and walking toward the stage. The camera that had filmed was good enough to capture her expression while she solved the equation, concentrated, silent, oblivious to the audience. The audio was clean. Professor Renato's confirmation was perfectly audible. The reaction of the room, too. The video was published in the early hours of Friday. By Saturday morning, it had 600,000 views. By Sunday afternoon, it surpassed 4 million. Fernanda learned of the video through Donna Conceição's cell phone, who appeared in the boarding house room with the device in hand and an expression she had never seen in that so-contained woman. Something between amazement and contained satisfaction, like someone watching an injustice being corrected by the weight of the facts themselves. "You are here," Donna Conceição said, pointing to the screen. Fernanda watched the video sitting on the edge of the bed, with the mango tree outside swaying gently in the Cerrado breeze. She watched once in silence. Then she closed the app and kept looking out the window for a while. "Aren't you going to comment on anything?" the coordinator asked. "I'm processing it," Fernanda said. What she was processing, in fact, was the speed. She had spent 1 year and 3 months being systematically invisible on that campus, and now, in less than 48 hours, there was a version of her with 4 million viewers. The disparity between those two states was cognitively difficult to accommodate. The comments on the video, which she read later with care and a calm that surprised herself, were almost unanimous in one sense. There was anger directed at Henrique Saldanha. There was admiration for her. There was an impressive amount of people sharing their own stories of invisibility, general services workers with diplomas kept in boxes, researchers who had left the system for reasons that were not just their own. The video had touched on something broader than a scene in an auditorium. There were also, in the middle of the comments, several mentions of her name. People who had researched Fernanda Leal and found the 3 published articles. A researcher from São Paulo had shared one of the articles with the observation that the methodology was pioneering for the period in which it was published. A pharmacology professor from Recife wrote that he had used that article in his graduate course for 2 consecutive semesters. She had not known that. On Monday morning, the university rector's office called an emergency meeting. Fernanda knew via a message from Professor Renato, who had spent the weekend exchanging emails with several departments and with the institution's legal counsel. The meeting was at 10. Renato asked if she could attend. Fernanda arrived at the administrative block at 9:50. She was wearing black pants and a white cotton blouse that she had ironed with care that morning, not because the meeting required formality, but because there was something in that gesture of preparation that organized the interior before the exterior. The meeting room had a long table with 12 chairs. There was the rector, 2 pro-rectors, the head of the Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences, Professor Renato, a university lawyer, and a representative from the human resources sector. Everyone raised their eyes when she entered. No one looked at the apron this time because she was not wearing it. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. The rector spoke first with a tone that balanced institutional recognition and reputation damage control, both in equal parts. The lawyer explained the legal instruments available for functional reintegration with maintenance of academic titles. The human resources representative had a folder with Fernanda's complete history. She saw her own name on the folder tab and felt something strange, like reading her own obituary while still alive. Renato spoke last. With the objectivity of someone who prepared arguments in advance, he presented a case for Fernanda's immediate reintegration into the doctoral program, with a reconstituted scholarship, access to the pharmacokinetics laboratory, and a relocated completion deadline. He had done the math. It was possible. "The issue," said the rector, with that way of an administrator who qualifies everything as an issue before treating it as an obstacle, "is that the reintegration process has stages. It is not something done in a week." "It can be done in 2, Renato said, "if there is the will." The silence that followed lasted the exact time of 7 people calculating the consequences of different choices. Fernanda looked at the rector. "I don't need favors," she said. "I need what was taken from me by documented institutional negligence. The records are in that folder." The lawyer lowered her eyes to the papers. The human resources representative blinked. The rector nodded slowly. "We will begin the process." On Thursday of the same week, Enrique Saldanha transferred the 3 million as promised. The transfer was made by a formal legal instrument with a receipt. His lawyer contacted Fernanda through a formal letter asking for a meeting. She accepted, on the condition that Professor Renato be present. The meeting took place on Friday, in an office in the center of Brasilia with wide windows and a view of the Eixo Monumental. Fernanda arrived with Renato. Enrique Saldanha arrived alone, a detail she noted and which said something about how he had chosen to frame that conversation. He was different from the man she had seen on the stage. Not more dejected. It wasn't that. He was more contained, like someone who spent the weekend reviewing something and reached the meeting with conclusions he was not yet sure how to present. "I want to apologize," he said before anything else. "What I said in the auditorium was unfair and did not represent the type of man I intend to be." Fernanda looked at him. The sentence was good, well structured. She had no way of knowing if it was true, but there was something in the timbre of the voice that didn't sound completely rehearsed. "I accept the apologies," she said, "but I would like to talk about something else." Enrique Saldanha raised his eyes. "The compound that your laboratory is developing," she said. "The solution I presented in the auditorium solves the modeling problem, but there is an additional implication that I didn't mention because I would need access to the complete data to confirm." The silence in the room changed quality. "What implication?" he asked. "The distribution asymmetry between compartments that I identified suggests that the therapeutic window of this compound may be significantly narrower than your researchers calculated, which changes the safety profile and the schedule of clinical trials." Enrique Saldanha remained quiet for a long moment. "If what you are saying is correct," he said slowly, "we are talking about months of rework. I am saying it is a hypothesis that needs to be investigated, Fernanda replied. With the laboratory data, I can confirm or discard it in 2 weeks. Enrique Saldanha's expression ran through several states in a few seconds. Then he turned to the window, looked at the Eixo Monumental for a moment, and said, without turning around, "When can you start?" Renato Cavalcante, beside Fernanda, folded his arms and waited for her answer. She thought of the laboratory with the right reagents, of the doctorate, of the son who would arrive in 3 months, of the 3 million that were in an account that she still barely processed as real. "Monday," she said. The pharmacokinetics laboratory of the Universidade Federal de Brasilia occupied the 3rd floor of the Bloco de Ciencias da Saúde, a series of connected rooms with grey granite benches, chromatography equipment, incubators, and that specific smell of solvent and cold air conditioning that Fernanda had loved since the first time she entered there, at 22 years old, as an undergraduate student in a voluntary internship. On Monday morning, she entered through that door for the first time in more than 2 years. There was a difference she had not anticipated. The space was the same, but she had changed. Not just the 7-month belly that reorganized her entire relationship with laboratory benches and chairs, but something internal, a layer of experience that didn't exist when she left. She had learned to see the laboratory from 2 angles, from the inside as a researcher, and from the outside as the person who cleaned the floor where the researchers worked. This second perspective would not disappear, and she had already decided she didn't want it to disappear. Professor Renato had provided a temporary visiting researcher badge while the formal reintegration process moved through the university bureaucracy. It was a simple laminated badge with the photo she had taken at the department reception the previous week. She put it in her blouse pocket and stood in the center of the laboratory for a moment, recognizing each piece of equipment like someone taking a silent inventory. The data from Grupo Saldanha arrived by secure protocol on Monday afternoon. It was a compressed file with 242 megabytes of raw data from laboratory trials, plasma concentration curves, biodistribution data in animal models, and a 41-page report that the laboratory research team had produced over 18 months. Fernanda spent the first afternoon reading the report in its entirety, taking notes by hand in a black-covered notebook she had bought that morning. Her handwriting was the same as on the auditorium board, small, precise, with no wasted space. The notes were not summaries, they were dialogues. She wrote a hypothesis, then an objection, then a question. An outside observer would have the impression of seeing a single person having a discussion with herself with a high level of technical sophistication. On the 4th page of the report, she found what she had suspected in the meeting with Enrique Saldanha. His team had calculated the distribution volume of the compound using a single compartment model, simplified, standard for the initial phase of development, but inadequate for that specific compound, which by the biodistribution data clearly accumulated differentially in adipose tissue. The error was not gross. It was the type of methodological choice that seems reasonable at the beginning of a project and accumulates imprecision over time, like a slightly miscalibrated compass that you only realize is wrong when you have already moved far from the starting point. The implications were exactly what she had intuited. The dose that the team had calculated as therapeutic could be sub- or supra-therapeutic, depending on the metabolic profile of the patient. In populations with a high percentage of body fat, elderly people, some chronic patients, profiles common for the type of condition the compound aimed to treat, the risk of toxicity was substantially higher than the current data indicated. She kept looking at that conclusion for a long time. There was a complex feeling in that moment that she didn't know how to name immediately. It wasn't the satisfaction of being right. It was something closer to responsibility. The awareness that that information had real weight, that there were people on the other side of that equation who were not hypotheses, but future individuals who would take that compound, trusting that someone had calculated the dose with care. She opened a new document and began to write the report. She worked until 19 hours. Then she went home, ate, slept 8 hours, returned at 8 in the morning. In 4 days, she had produced a 36-page analysis that completely reconstructed the pharmacokinetic modeling of the compound using a bicompartmental model, with simulations of plasma concentration for 7 different population profiles and a revised proposal of a therapeutic window with specific safety ranges by group. The report was sent to Grupo Saldanha on Thursday at the end of the afternoon. On Friday morning, Henrique Saldanha called her cell phone. She was in the laboratory when the phone rang, a number she didn't recognize, but which she answered because she had started answering numbers she didn't recognize since the world had decided she existed. "I read the report," he said, without preamble, without greeting, direct, like someone still processing while speaking. "All night." "And?" she said. "You are right." A pause. "My team is meeting now reviewing the data. My research director said it is the most rigorous analytical work we have received from outside in the last 5 years. Fernanda remained quiet. "This is going to delay the project by at least 8 months, he continued. "We will need to redo the dose trials with the new parameters." 8 months is better than what would have happened in clinical trials, she said. "I know." Another pause, longer. "Fernanda, I would like to propose something." "You can propose," she said. "A formal consultancy. You review the compound development protocols with us as a contracted researcher, with remuneration compatible with the level of analysis you presented." He stopped. "And with a clause that guarantees your academic autonomy, no exclusivity, you continue the doctorate." She stood still with the phone to her ear for a few seconds. Through the laboratory window, she saw a piece of the Brasilia sky, that specific blue, high and clean, that doesn't exist in other places in Brazil in the same way. "I need 2 days to think," she said. "Of course. And I want the contract to go through Professor Renato Cavalcante for review." "That is also planned," he said. She hung up and stood still for a moment. The baby moved, that rotating movement she recognized, the shoulder settling. She placed her hand on her abdomen and stayed like that, in the silence of the laboratory that smelled of solvent and cold air, with the black-covered notebook open on the bench beside her. There was something Henrique Saldanha didn't know, that she hadn't told anyone yet, in fact. Information that was in the report she had sent, buried in the technical footnotes that only a very attentive specialist would identify. Information that changed not just the project schedule, but the entire trajectory of the compound. She had identified in the bicompartmental simulations a distribution profile that suggested an unexpected secondary effect, not toxic but therapeutically relevant for a completely different condition than the one the compound originally aimed to treat. A possibility that, if confirmed, could expand the reach of the project in a way that transformed the nature of the research. She had put that in the footnotes because she needed more data before elevating it to the main body of the document. It was a hypothesis still, but it was a hypothesis she considered promising enough to investigate with urgency, and there was a personal reason for that urgency that no one knew. In the email inbox of the account she had used for years, there was a report, a medical report from the prenatal care, received 3 weeks before the Congress, with test results that the obstetrician had requested, with an expression doctors use when they want to seem neutral, but are not completely. The report described a metabolic condition in her son, not yet diagnosed with precision, still being monitored, but with characteristics that the compound she had been analyzing, by the new profile she had discovered, could potentially treat. Fernanda had not told this to anyone, not yet. She needed to be sure before transforming a scientific hypothesis into personal hope. But that was why she had worked all week with that particular intensity, that focus that went beyond technique. That was why the simulations had been done for 7 population profiles, and the 7th profile, the one no one had asked for, corresponded to a newborn with the characteristics that appeared in the report. She closed the black-covered notebook and looked out the window. The Brasilia sky remained blue, high and clean. She had work to do. Fernanda's son was born on a Tuesday morning in September, with the Cerrado sun entering obliquely through the university hospital windows and the monitors making their continuous and indifferent sounds. She was alone in the room when she went into labor at 3 in the morning, and it was alone that she arrived at the hospital by taxi, with the bag prepared 2 weeks ago at the entrance of the room and the black-covered notebook inside, because she had taken that notebook everywhere in the last 2 months and wouldn't know how to leave it behind. The labor lasted 6 hours. Donna Conceição arrived at 6 in the morning without anyone having called. She had somehow calculated the right moment, as she did with all the needs that the people around her didn't know how to name out loud. She stayed outside the delivery room and was in the corridor when Fernanda came out with her son for the first time. He weighed 3 kilos and 200 grams, had closed eyes and clenched hands near his face with that specific intensity of newborns, as if they were preparing arguments. Fernanda kept looking at him for a long time before saying anything. "Pedro," she said finally. The name she had chosen alone, without consulting anyone, for reasons that belonged entirely to her. In the first days, she stayed in the hospital while the doctors monitored Pedro and confirmed what the prenatal report had suggested. The condition was a rare metabolic alteration that affected the way a specific group of enzymes processed certain substrates, treatable, the doctors said, with proper monitoring. Not serious, but with long-term implications that would need continuous attention. Fernanda listened to each explanation with 2 types of attention simultaneously, that of the mother, who wanted to understand what her son would need, and that of the researcher, who was already calculating, while the doctor spoke, how much the Grupo Saldanha data overlapped with that clinical picture. She said nothing yet. She needed to confirm. In the second week after Pedro's birth, she sent a message to Professor Renato. She asked for a meeting for when she could leave the hospital. He replied in minutes. The meeting took place a week later in Renato's office in the department, with Pedro sleeping in a stroller beside Fernanda's chair. She opened the black-covered notebook to the page where she had done the simulations of the metabolic profile and placed it on the table beside Pedro's report. Renato took a few minutes to read. When he finished, he remained in silence for a time that she respected. "Are you saying that Saldanha's compound, with the new distribution profile you mapped, could have efficacy for this specific enzyme?" he said finally. "It is a hypothesis. It needs experimental validation. But the pharmacokinetic parameters I calculated are consistent with the profile of Pedro's condition." She stopped. "Renato, I know that mixing personal interest with research is methodologically problematic. I know I need someone from outside to validate this hypothesis independently." "That's why you're telling me," he said. "That's why I'm telling you." Renato kept looking at the documents for another moment. Then he looked at Pedro, who was sleeping with his hands near his face as always, then at Fernanda. "I'm going to call Helena Moraes," he said. "She coordinates the Pediatric Pharmacology Laboratory at USP. She is the best person to validate this hypothesis independently." He paused. "And I'm going to call Saldanha." Fernanda nodded. The call with Henrique Saldanha took place via video conference 2 days later. With Renato, Fernanda, and the research director of Grupo Saldanha, a man in his 50s named Marcos Vidal, whose reputation Fernanda knew through articles. She presented the hypothesis with the objectivity of someone who deliberately separated the son's clinical data from the scientific argument. She didn't mention Pedro until the end, and even then only as the origin context of the hypothesis, not as an emotional argument. Marcos Vidal remained quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said to Henrique Saldanha, "It is one of the best-founded compound redirection hypotheses I have ever received without experimental data." Henrique Saldanha looked at Fernanda through the camera. "What do you need to validate it?" "Access to samples of the compound in the concentrations I calculated, a cellular model for the initial trials, and autonomy to publish the results independently of commercial interest, whether the hypothesis is confirmed or refuted." "You will have all 3, he said. The formal contract was signed 3 weeks after Pedro's birth, consultancy with academic autonomy, appropriate remuneration, and a specific clause that Fernanda had requested and Renato had reviewed. Any therapeutic development with pediatric application resulting from the research would have a zero-cost access program for low-income families, funded by Grupo Saldanha. Henrique Saldanha had signed that clause without negotiating. That had said something to Fernanda that the formal apologies had not completely said. The trials began the following month. Professor Helena Moraes from São Paulo joined as an external collaborator. The university laboratory was equipped with a chromatography instrument that Henrique Saldanha had provided on a loan basis, a piece of equipment that Fernanda had identified as necessary on the list she gave to the department, and which had arrived without negotiation in less than 2 weeks. Pedro grew. He slept poorly in the first weeks, and Fernanda discovered she could work in the early hours in a more concentrated way than she had in years, as if physical fatigue filtered out the noise and left only the essential. She worked with him in the stroller beside her, in the intervals between feedings with the black-covered notebook open and the data on the computer screen. Dona Conceição appeared sometimes with food. Renato sometimes called her for meetings in the department and held Pedro in his lap while she presented results to other professors who, gradually, stopped pretending they weren't surprised by the quality of the work. In November, 2 months after Pedro's birth, the first experimental data arrived from the laboratory in São Paulo. The hypothesis was confirmed. Not completely, science rarely offers completeness in the first data, but enough for Professor Helena Moraes to send an email to Renato with the subject line, "We need to talk about this with urgency." The compound, in the bicompartmental concentrations Fernanda had calculated, showed significant affinity with the enzyme that Pedro's condition affected. There was still a path to travel. There were still safety trials, efficacy trials, dose trials, months of work, but the door had opened. Fernanda read the email in the laboratory, with Pedro in the stroller beside her, awake and looking at the ceiling with the inscrutable concentration of small babies. She didn't cry. She stayed quiet for a while, looking at her son, and then at the data on the screen, and then at her son again. Then she picked up the black-covered notebook, opened it to a new page, and began to write the protocol for the next phase of the trials. There was work to do, and she was exactly in the place where that work could be done. Outside, the Cerrado was in the transition between the drought and the first rains of November, that moment when the air becomes heavy for days before the first rain comes, and everything around stays in a kind of silent anticipation. Fernanda had learned to love that season, that specific quality of the air before something changes. It was the type of moment that those who don't pay attention don't notice, but that those who have spent enough time looking at things with care recognize as the instant where everything is about to transform. The second Congresso Nacional de Inovação Farmacêutica took place in the same auditorium, in the same month of the following year. The difference was in almost everything else. The event poster, this time, bore the name of Fernanda Leal in letters that were not small. She was the keynote speaker for the closing session, a position that Professor Renato had negotiated with the event organization with the tranquility of someone presenting a fact, not a request. Pedro, at 7 months, was with Dona Conceição in a support room that the university had made available at the organization's request, equipped with a portable crib and a video monitor that Fernanda could consult between sessions. She arrived at the auditorium at 8 in the morning, an hour before the start, not through the service corridor. The auditorium was being prepared the same way as a year ago. Technicians, banners, the registration desk at the entrance. But the way people reacted to her presence was completely different. There was no evaluation gaze that runs over the apron and decides there is nothing interesting. There was recognition, sometimes contained, sometimes enthusiastic, always with that specific lightness of someone seeing someone they admire. Fernanda greeted those who approached her with the same brief kindness as always. She had not changed her way of speaking. She had decided, consciously, that she didn't need to. The blackboard was still in the center of the stage. The university administration had considered removing it for the occasion, and Fernanda had requested that it stay. She had not explained why, and no one had insisted. At 9 o'clock, the auditorium was full. 380 people, according to the registration spreadsheet the communication assistant had shown her with pride, 80 more than the previous year's event. There were researchers from 15 states, representatives of private and public laboratories, undergraduate and graduate students, and at least 3 journalists from specialized outlets. And there was Henrique Saldanha in the 3rd row, without assistance. Fernanda noticed him when she went down from the stage to drink water before her presentation. He was sitting with his hands over the notebook he was holding, his posture different from a year ago, no less imposing, but in a different way, as if the imposition now came from another place. He nodded briefly when she saw him. She nodded back. She had not simply resolved the tension between them, she had found a more complex and more honest balance. He had made a mistake publicly and fulfilled the consequence. He had contributed resources to research that was now moving forward promisingly. He had signed a clause that put therapeutic access above maximum profit. None of that erased the comment on the microphone, but neither was it irrelevant. Fernanda had decided that people could be more than one thing at the same time, and that recognizing that was not naivety, it was precision. The closing session began at 15 hours. The rector made the introduction, and this time the praise had changed register. No longer the tone of an administrator containing damage, but something that sounded closer to genuine, with the lightness of someone who realized, late but for real, that they had something rare on their campus and had taken too long to notice. Fernanda went up to the stage with a thin folder under her arm and the official event badge around her neck. The laboratory had provided a white lab coat, but she had chosen not to wear it. She was wearing a dark blue blouse and black pants, simple, precise, without ornament. She placed the folder on the podium and looked at the audience for a moment before starting. "A year ago," she said, "I was in this auditorium with a cleaning apron and a cleaning cart. Today I am here with a research folder. The equation on the board is the same." She turned to the blackboard at the back. "And the error that was in it still reminds me that knowledge does not warn from where it will arrive." The audience went silent. "What I'm going to present today is the result of 12 months of collaborative work between the Universidade Federal de Brasilia, Grupo Saldanha, and the Pediatric Pharmacology Laboratory of USP. She opened the folder and took out the first set of slides. It concerns a compound with an asymmetric bicompartmental distribution profile, the same one I identified on that board, which demonstrated, in preliminary trials, significant efficacy for a rare metabolic enzymatic alteration in the pediatric population. The auditorium was completely quiet. Fernanda presented the data with the didactic clarity that had been observed a year before, not as a performance, but as a habit. She did not simplify unnecessarily nor complicate to impress. She presented what it was, with the precision of someone who respects both the subject and those who are listening. When she reached the last section of the presentation, she stopped for a moment. "I need to contextualize something," she said. "When I started this research, I had a technical interest in the compound, but there was also an interest that I did not declare publicly because I needed data before making it relevant." The room became even quieter, if that was possible. "My son Pedro has the metabolic condition that this compound demonstrates potential to treat." She paused. "I was the researcher, and I was the mother. These two roles coexisted in this work. I took all measures to ensure that one did not contaminate the other. External review, independent collaboration, publishable data. But I consider it honest that this room knows there was a personal reason why I took this problem to the laboratory at 3 in the morning more than once." There was a silence different from any other she had experienced in that auditorium. It was not the silence of surprise, nor that of waiting. It was the silence of 380 people choosing simultaneously to listen with the part of themselves that understands that science is made by people with stories. "Pedro is 7 months old," she continued. "The preliminary trials are promising. There is a path to travel, but there is a path." In the third row, Henrique Saldanha had his eyes fixed on the stage with an expression she couldn't completely classify from there, but which was not the expression of a man calculating. It was the expression of a man paying attention. After the presentation, when the applause ended and the auditorium began to dissolve into conversations and corridors, Fernanda stood still for a moment in the center of the stage, with the folder closed under her arm and the blackboard at her back. Professor Renato went up to the stage and stood beside her without saying anything for a moment. Then he said in a low voice that there was a line of researchers who wanted to talk to her. She nodded. There would be time. But before that, she turned to the blackboard. She picked up the same short chalk from the tray. She had asked them to leave it there, specifically that one, and wrote a sentence at the bottom of the board, below the equation that was still there from the previous year. They were 7 words: talent has no uniform, science has no owner. She put the chalk back, turned around, and went down the 2 steps of the stage to meet the people who were waiting for her. 6 months after the Second Congress, the Universidade Federal de Brasilia inaugurated a laboratory that was not planned in any institutional plan of the previous 3 years. It was a space on the ground floor of the Bloco de Ciências da Saúde, previously occupied by a cleaning supplies storage room that no one had known what to use for, with new benches, modern equipment, and a wide window that looked out onto the central courtyard where the cerrado trees grew with that silent obstinacy that Fernanda had learned to admire. The name of the laboratory was on the acrylic plate fixed to the door: Laboratório de Identificação e Desenvolvimento de Talentos em Pesquisa, LIDEP. There was no famous surname on the plate. There was no sponsor's name. It was just the name of the place and what it proposed to do. The idea had been born in a conversation between Fernanda and Professor Renato, 3 months after the Second Congress, on a Wednesday afternoon when neither of them had a meeting scheduled and the coffee in the department room had turned out well. She had spoken about something that had bothered her since that year, not what had happened to her specifically, but the pattern of which her story was just an example. How many Fernandas were there in how many campuses in Brazil, cleaning corridors that were once theirs, carrying knowledge in work aprons, invisible to a system that had failed to see them? Renato had stayed quiet for a while. Then he said, "Then let's create a way to see them." LIDEP functioned as an active identification program. It did not wait for talents to reveal themselves in dramatic situations before 300 people. It went to where they were. Partnership with the university's human resources sector, with the outsourced general services company, with the gates and university restaurants. A simple form, voluntary, anonymous if the person wanted, asking about previous education, areas of interest, if there was any interrupted work the person would like to resume. No grandiose promises, just honest questions. In the first 4 months, 43 people responded to the form. There was a gardening assistant with an incomplete degree in biology who had left for financial reasons and never returned, a cook from the university restaurant with a master's in food chemistry, and an article published in a regional journal that no one had read, a security guard from the night shift who had spent 2 semesters in an engineering program before needing to work full-time. Each story was specific. Each interruption had its own reasons: financial, family, bureaucratic, sometimes a combination of all 3 with an accident along the way. There was no single villain in any of them, just as there was none in her own. There was a system that had been built assuming that people with academic capacity arrived at the system with the material conditions to remain in it, and that when they left, it was because they had chosen to leave. LIDEP did not solve the system. Fernanda was the first to say that, with the clarity of someone who does not tolerate wishful thinking in science or in institutional politics. What it did was open a crack, create a return mechanism for those who had fallen through the gaps, with reconstituted scholarships, schedule flexibility, access to the laboratory outside standard hours if necessary. Henrique Saldanha had contributed the initial funding for LIDEP, not as a redemptive gesture, but as a contract with goals and accountability, the same as any institutional partnership. Fernanda had insisted on that. He had agreed without resistance, which continued to be, for her, the most revealing data about what the experience had done to that man. They were not friends. Fernanda didn't know if they ever would be, and she had decided that was fine. There was between them a respect built on real consequences and real work, more solid in her evaluation than many relationships that began with sympathy and built nothing beyond it. Pedro was 13 months old when LIDEP was inaugurated. He was present at the opening ceremony, not yet by his own choice, but because Fernanda carried him in her arms while the rector spoke, and Renato cut the ribbon with scissors that had clearly been brought from home because they were too big for the little plaque. Pedro spent the entire ceremony looking at the trees in the courtyard with that inscrutable attention that had not changed since the first days. The most recent follow-up exams were good. There was a path to travel still. The compound was in the clinical trial phase, and Pedro had regular follow-up with a pediatric team Fernanda had assembled with the care of someone who knows what she is doing. But there was stability, and there was, above all, perspective. Fernanda was, on that day, 8 months away from completing her doctorate. She had 3 new articles submitted, 2 co-authored, with Professor Helena Moraes, 1 solo. The 3rd solo article was about the compound, about the identification of the bicompartmental profile, about the therapeutic redirection hypothesis. There was a footnote in the 3rd article that said, in precise academic language, the central hypothesis of this work was originally formulated at 4:23 a.m. in the auditorium of Bloco C of the Universidade Federal de Brasília during the execution of general services tasks. She had placed that note there with deliberation. It was a methodological datum, and it was also a statement. On that inauguration afternoon, after the rector left and Renato went to a department meeting and people slowly filed out, Fernanda stayed alone in the new laboratory for a few minutes. Pedro was with Dona Conceição in the corridor. The smell of the space was still of new paint and packaging plastic. Soon it would be the right smell, that of solvent and cold air conditioning. She ran her hand over the bench surface. She placed the black-covered notebook on it, the same one, already with 2/3 of the pages filled. She opened to the new page she had marked that morning. At the top of the page, she wrote the date. Then she stayed quiet for a moment, looking at the cerrado trees through the wide window. A heron had landed on the courtyard grass, white, motionless, with that specific quality of presence animals have when they don't know they are being observed. Fernanda kept looking at the heron for a long time. Then she lowered her eyes to the notebook and began to write, "End of story." If Fernanda's story touched something in you, that feeling of recognizing someone who carries more than they appear, someone who continues even when the world stops looking, then you know exactly why this channel exists. Here, every week, there is a new story waiting for those who have the courage to listen until the end. If you've made it this far, you are that kind of person. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and tell us in the comments. What part of Fernanda's story stayed with you? Each comment is a way of saying that stories like this matter, and they matter because they are real, not in the facts, but in what they reveal about what we are capable of carrying and of building when someone finally decides to look.